So a bunch of you have asked me about how to find a good grief therapist. And I gotta say it's hard. I still find myself apologizing for my profession a lot. So one thing happens though, like I spend so much time with amazing people doing really, really good, well-skilled work in the world that I can kind of forget how bad it is out there. And then I talk to a newly grieving person and the horror stories I hear are horror stories. Therapists that tell you you need to buck up and get over it, therapists that are still trotting out those old, tired, useless stages of grief models, the ones who immediately go to, now what do you think caused this? Or some other like incredibly pompous, unskilled, not compassionate, not good response. So, on behalf of my profession, I'm sorry, y'all. It's still really bad out there. I'm a therapist, so I can say that, I think. The problem is, well, there are a lot of problems, but we're only going to get into a few of them here because I want to get on to the solutions. So when you go to school to become a licensed social worker or a counselor, if they talk about grief at all in your training program, it's usually lumped in with death and dying, and it gets maybe one 90-minute class on death, dying, and bereavement. Who even says bereavement anymore? No one, except, anyway, no one uses that word anymore. So if it gets taught at all, it gets taught in this tiny little segment where it's lumped in with death and dying, which is not the same thing. Grief and dying, not the same process. Anyway, it's really weird that it still gets taught that way or sort of doesn't get taught that way in graduate school, given that every single person who comes in through your door as a therapist, every single person is going to be carrying grief of some kind, and yet we don't talk about it. We don't talk about the skills that you need to come to it, to answer it, to speak to it, to listen to it, any of that stuff. Still trotting out those stages of grief, they weren't relative back in the 70s and the early 80s when we first started talking about the stages of grief. So this is actually part of why we're doing what we're doing here together, everybody, with the whole grief revolution thing, is that we have got to get better at this stuff because it is bad. And we are training our clinicians badly. Badly. There is a need to start talking about this stuff in ways that are really effective and useful. That's going to start happening because I'm doing that work. A lot of other amazing people are starting to do that work and really push schools and medical providers to get better, to learn the skills that they need, to stop leaning on these old tropes that were not useful when they were new, and they certainly aren't useful now. So we're getting there, and we're getting things better. It's just, it's still tricky. So finding a good grief therapist. I'm so glad that so many of you have written or sent me messages or made comments that you found a great therapist to sit with you in your grief, and I am always so overjoyed to hear that. Honestly, I hear about 85% horror stories, so that 15% of you who have found a good person, I love it. Thank you for letting me know about that stuff. So how do you find a good grief therapist? It's tricky. So the first thing I would say to do is go look at their website, right? Everybody's got a website these days. It doesn't even have to be a good website. We're not judging them on their tech skills because we know that I'm not awesome at tech. So look at their website. How do they talk about the work that they do? How do they talk about their clients or their patients, depending on the kind of person that you're seeing, how they talk about their people? What do you know about them by what you see on their website? If they are all puppy dogs and rainbows and we can get this thing kicked and you can go back to your happy old self because happiness is the goal, click away from that crap, right? You can tell a lot about a person. You can tell a lot about a clinician by the way they talk about things on their website, right? Look at the books they recommend. Are they Getting Over Your Grief in 5 Easy Steps? Or are they my book? Or are they Joanne Cacciatore's book? Like, what are they saying? You can always look at the details and find out some useful information. Basically, what I want you doing is looking for cues as to how somebody might be with you. If they're going to look at your grief as a problem to be solved, out the door. Don't even bother with them, right? If you look at somebody's website and you're like, maybe this might be a little bit of a something, then send them an email, right? I would say call them, but we know that's not going to happen. So send them an email. Tell them very briefly about your situation and ask them, actually, you know what? Don't tell them about your situation at all, because we are, in fact, testing them. Drop them an email and say you're looking for a new therapist because you're going through some stuff in your life and you'd like to know their thoughts about grief and how they come to grief in their practice. What they tell you will give you all of the information that you need to know. Again, you're looking for details. You're looking for clues. Do they talk about their 5 easy steps? And if you just change your thoughts, you can be back to the happiness train or whatever. Or do they come back with something a little bit more thoughtful? Do they come back saying that grief is not a problem to be solved and it's an experience to be tended? We love it if they say that, right? So you are looking for clues as to how they come to grief. If you found somebody that you think is pretty good, then make an appointment with them, right? It's an introduction appointment. Remember that you are hiring somebody to be your ally. It means, in a way, they work for you, right? So when you come to your first session, you can tell them a little bit about who you are and what you're living, and tell them what hasn't worked and what has been helping at least a little bit or making things suck a little bit less, and ask them for their thoughts on it. What would you do with a person like me, right? Doing all of that pre-work, that prep work, that takes a lot of effort, I know, and you don't have a lot of mojo to spare. This is actually a really good time for your friends and family who desperately want to be of help. This is a really good thing for them to do. If they keep saying, what can I do for you? Just let me know if you need anything. Tell them, start looking in the needle in the haystack with some therapists for me, right? Like, you go do the Google searches at 3 o'clock in the morning for 4 hours. Have them do all of that, looking for clues, looking at minor details, looking for the ways that people talk about grief. Have them sort it down. Winnow it down to, 5 to 9, because I like odd numbers, 5 to 9 people that might be a good match for you. And then do what I just said earlier, which is send them an email. Ask them what their approach is to grief. How do they feel about grief? What do they know about grief? It's not necessarily true that you have to find a therapist who has lived what you're living. That's not always true. It does sometimes help if they've had an experience with deep, life-altering grief or loss in some way. It can help, but that's not a guarantee either. What you're really looking for is somebody who has the capacity to bear witness to that which cannot be fixed. They are out there. They really, really are. It just takes a lot of looking and a lot of legwork. So do be sure to ask your friends and family if they're offering anyway. Have them do that legwork. Get them down to a handful of people that you can check in with on your own, and then give it a go. Remember that if it's not a match for you, you don't have to stay. You are already doing so much work. I don't want you in a position where, one, somebody's treating you like crap and calling it clinical work, because no. But I also don't want you to feel like you're the one who has to educate a clinician on what grief really is. That's my job, right? I'm working on it. We're going to get things better. We're going to get things better for clinicians because they feel helpless in the face of grief because they haven't been taught the right ways to respond to it. And I want things better for them, and I want them to be able to better give you the kind of support and attention that you most need, so it's not so bloody hard. So that is my first short-ish answer on how to find a decent grief therapist. We're working on making it better out there for you, everybody, but do keep looking. You deserve to find beautiful support. And it's out there. Just a little digging. Let me know what you find.